Welcome to the Nordic Mythology Podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand, owner of the company Horns of Odin. And before we get into the show, as always, I do have to plug our Patreon. I know I say it every single week, but it is the lifeline to the podcast. It's how we're able to keep going. So although I do say it every week, it is vital. And hopefully some of you can just pop over to Patreon/ Nordic Mythology Podcast and check out the different tiers we've got there. One of the main bonuses is the Q&A episode that you get. It's a bonus episode every single week. And it's just a bumper pack, an extension pack to the main show. So you get the main episode, and then to go with each main episode, we have maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, extra content. It's an extra conversation, but the patrons who watch live, and also you get to submit your questions ahead of time if you want. And basically you get to put your questions to our guests. A lot of the time I miss a ton of things. So in those little extra kind of 20 minutes, half an hour, you get so much information. And they tend to be a little bit more lighthearted. I don't know what it is, but the guests tend to maybe let their hair down after the main show and it becomes a little more fun, a little more jokey. They are a lot of fun. And you get the whole back catalog when you sign up. So you sign up for £3 a month and you could literally listen, if you could fit them in, you could listen to years of extra content and then get rid of it, I guess, after a month if you wanted to. I mean, I wouldn't like that, but that's kind of what the deal you get. You get access to everything and it's not just going forward. And you know what? I'm really excited to get into this show. So if you can leave us a 5-star rating, positive review wherever you get your podcast, please do that. And then check us out on YouTube, like, subscribe, all those things. But this is a topic that I love, and I've actually got some really cool questions that I actually saw pop up on Facebook just when I was posting this episode. Some real nice kind of angles that I'd not thought of, so I'm looking forward to getting to those. So my guest today is Luca Panaro, and Luca is a PhD candidate in comparative literature at the University of Iceland, studying the popular reception of Old Norse culture, particularly in video games. So Luca, thank you for joining me. I hope I got your surname correct.
Yeah, you did perfect. Thank you
Oh,
so much for having me.
wonderful. Yeah, this is a fun topic because I think that there is that crossover. I think a lot of gamers also quite like Nordic mythology, Norse mythology, and a lot of history in general, I think.
Yeah, history is probably the biggest kind of resource for video games of all things. There's like a subfield now in game studies called historical game studies that's just exploding right now with new titles and conferences and journals popping up all over the place because of how big of an area it is and how popular it's become. So people are sort of retroactively sort of taking account for how important history is
Mm.
as sort of a resource and inspiration for video games. Almost every age has kind of been imagined or channeled in some way in games or in aspects of games,
Mhm.
and it
Do,
just keeps
I,
going on. Yeah.
I was gonna say, do you think part of that's driven by the popularity of the Assassin's Creed genre? Because, like I say, I'm not a huge gamer, but for me, it's kind of like, I have gamed in the past, and when I was younger, more so. That one always sticks out as being one that's really kind of tried to have some historical accuracy. I know obviously there's the whole Notre Dame story about how when they tried to rebuild the cathedral, they're going to use the footage from the game because it was mapped
Right.
so well. So
Yeah.
do you think that that kind of accuracy has led to, driven the popularity in it?
Yeah. I mean, Assassin's Creed in particular is a game series that uh, markets itself very well on its historical
Mm,
kind of reconstructions. How it does use that kind of term, like this accurate portrayals of these periods of history, and with good reason they have done extensive research for each of these games. They take on historians as consultants. They do this like these intense, 3D architectural mapping, like as you mentioned, with the that are so accurate that they're used in the reconstruction or rehabilitation of actual historical buildings that they've ported into these games. And that's like that series is a really big part of kind of what people think of when they imagine a historical video game or a historically accurate video game.
Hmm.
And it's also one of the most studied kind of historical games in this field that I mentioned, historical game studies, because it blurs the boundaries between video game and historical simulation in a lot of ways. So people like interrogating these kinds of concepts by using Assassin's Creed as games as case studies. All the recent ones, back to the original first ones set during first one set during the
Hmm.
Crusades. Um, but it also goes well beyond that. I mean, other that's like this kind of action adventure type game with stealth gameplay, based to obviously based around the idea of assassinations of historical personages. So it's it digs deep into this sort of historical narrative. But other games, these so-called real-time strategy games, or 4X, these kind of massive army controlling conquest games, things like Crusader Kings and Europa Universalis, going back also to, of course, the famous stuff like Age of Empires, Age of Mythology.
Hmm.
These games are also very big in using these historical cultures, and then completely, destroying, history by making, India conquer England and things like this. Like you
Hmm.
can rewrite and do counterfactual history with these games. Um, so there's a lot of different ways that history comes into play. Uh, and what I end up sort of looking at is um, how history and fantasy are extremely overlapping categories in at least in our Western kind of minds, because of how much historical medieval European literature, particularly Northern European literature, went into the foundational works of fantasy literature. And this is why you have, so many Old Norse things in fantasy, even before Vikings kind of became really popular again in this
Hmm.
past, a decade and a half or so, kind of since
Yeah.
2010 is where I put the sort of watershed year, of when they've enjoyed this renewed, like very, very high level of attention.
What do
Um,
you, is there a point that kind of kicked that off? Is it as simple as just the Vikings TV show, or did we see it
yeah,
rising before that?
I say 2011, usually, because in 2011 you get the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, so one of
Hmm.
the most successful medieval fantasy role-playing video games of all time, that's based in this sort of pseudo-Nordic fantasy world called Skyrim. You get the first adaptation of the Marvel Thor movie,
Okay, yeah.
and you get the first season of Game of Thrones launching. And then 2
Mhm.
years later, you get the first season of History Channel's Vikings.
Okay.
So,
So,
but yeah, go ahead.
sorry to jump in, but what do you think then sparks that? Because obviously these things aren't just made by coincidence. You have these three pretty big titles that all come out, and they're not exactly the same, but they're quite similar in this, medieval esque. And then obviously you have the Viking show coming out after. So you have that some sort of resurgence in this time period or style. What do you think starts that? Because you would assume that must be an industry thing, maybe that happens 3, 4 years prior that they go, okay, we're going to now look at this type. Does that make sense? Or is that how it works? Do they go, well, let's, for example, the vampire thing was done when I was a kid, everything was vampire, and then that kind of just disappeared. Is it that kind
Right.
of thing where it's contrived by big industry and they go, right, next is this?
I mean, I think there's a lot of that at play. Um, People get very up in arms, of course, about, their their cultural media of choice. Um, People have, huge fights about this stuff online, in
Yeah.
person, on forums and things like that. Uh, Particularly with video games, because there's such a strong culture of playing games and consuming games and talking about games. Um, and it's often, very toxic in some ways. Um, but people sometimes forget. Most of the time, it's pretty obvious. But people sometimes forget that this is like a huge multi-billion-dollar multi-billion dollar a year industry, national or so yeah, international industry. Um, and so these products are very much like products, and they're generated to turn a profit. And so there is a lot of this kind of like industry uh, uh, planning behind when these things happen. With that kind of watershed year of 2011, those three big things dropping. I mean, obviously these were released that year, which means they were being made
Hmm.
many years in advance. Um, a typical Hollywood movie is at least a few years in the making. Um, and this was one of this was back when the Marvel stuff was still kind of, picking up steam. It wasn't the full, you know,
Yeah.
massive thing that it is now, this universe. Um, but the Elder Scrolls Skyrim, of course, was the first Elder Scrolls game since, uh, oh, when was the previous one? I think was 2007 or something. So that was like 4 years they spent at least making that. Or maybe earlier. I'm probably messing up my game history right now, but
Hmm.
and then of course a TV show like Game of Thrones, which completely shattered our perceptions of what a show could be up to that point of how massive it was, and how kind of detailed it was. So they spent many years making that, but yeah, Morrowind. I just forget when it was really 2004 or 2007 something. I think 2004.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know whether these were all like planned. But I think saying like, oh, the vampire thing, oh, but that's over. So what's the next thing? Ah, like maybe a few people were like, well, it's the maybe Vikings now.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it was all, all these kind of different, because these are the three big industries. This was a film, a television show, and a video game. And I don't know
Hmm.
if they were all collaborating or like loosely collaborating in the loosest sense of that word, but
Hmm.
more maybe they were riding some sort of they were feeling the sea change in what was popular then. Okay,
Yeah.
2002. Thank you for the release of the previous. So yeah, that means that Skyrim. Not that they immediately started developing Skyrim after they released Morrowind in 2002, but uh, probably not that long after they started
Yeah.
the very early levels of development, which means
Hmm.
roughly 8, 7 years or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and the big thing that also shifted uh, popular culture back towards the medieval, which kind of set the stage for Vikings, was definitely Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings film trilogy.
Okay.
Because those made it mainstream to be nerdy. Like things like when you see Stranger Things, them playing Dungeons and Dragons down in the basement as this nerdy outcast young boys. Um, that's very much how this kind of geek culture was. Before
Hmm.
those movies, made it extremely popular to like elves and wizards, basically, made it okay to like elves and wizards
Yeah.
publicly because everyone had seen how fantastic those films were and where everyone was pretty
Hmm.
much on board with it after that. So that's sort of in the loosest sense of the word, that set the stage for this to be able to be so big, I think.
Hmm. I think 'cause I remember seeing the Lord of the Rings film at the cinema when they first came out, and I can't remember how old I was, but I must have been high school age. And I think it definitely will have made a shift, but it probably took a few years to really set in and allow that nerdiness. 'Cause I would think that the Marvel films will have played a big part in that kind of coolness around comic books as well,
Yeah.
and that helps that shift of because it is that nerdiness isn't the the kind of sentence it used to be from when 20, 30 years ago, being a nerd was quite a negative thing. Whereas now, people wear it with honor. It's a different, it's taken a whole different meaning now, which is lovely to see.
Yeah, yeah. No, yeah, there's Marvel hoodies all over the place now.
Hmm.
People
Yeah,
with Lord of the Rings shirts and
we're all big nerds at heart.
yeah, that's a huge motivator uh
Uh-huh.
for people who get into medieval studies. Every one of us medieval studies scholars has like a geek fandom, moment
Mhm.
when we're a child. We watch something or we read something that initially gets us radicalized into the Middle Ages, into the fantasy stuff, and then
What?
we all follow the thread back to the medieval literature, the medieval history that inspired it.
So what was yours?
Uh, I mean, mine was less direct because my dad basically spent uh uh he would read me like Greek myths and
Okay.
like the Iliad and Odyssey when I was a
Mhm.
very young child, like to sleep. So I grew
Uh,
up with like those that kind of classical mythology and stories.
how
But
old are you,
it's
if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 29. I was born in 1995.
Okay, so I'm 35 now. Yeah, 35. So we're similar
Yeah,
aged. And I was
yeah.
thinking, when you said that, it just popped into my head that when I was young, I feel like Greek mythology was much more
It was
popular.
huge. Yeah,
And
this
you had
was
the original God of War games, and that
yeah,
seemed to be very popular. And it's kind of
yeah.
shifted that all to like the Nordic stuff now.
Yeah, you had like Percy Jackson books when I was like just a young, like, but I think those came out when I was 5 or something like that, or maybe a little later. But um, and yeah, the first God of War I think is 2004. Right.
Yeah, hang on, I can pull it up if you.
I know. Yeah, I have a list of games, uh,
Oh,
but
okay.
but because these are the first ones are Greek, I actually haven't. Uh,
2005?
2005,
Yeah, 2005.
2005. So that's yeah, all this stuff was super popular, and then. Yeah, but for me it was things like games like, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time that were
What a
just
game that
pure,
is, though.
yeah, just pure fantasy nonsense.
Hmm.
No direct references to, historical things. I mean,
Hmm.
there's probably a ton of details, but I haven't analyzed these games like that, and I haven't played them in like 20 years. So,
Yeah.
um, but these kinds of like immersive fantasy worlds are the kinds of things that hooked me. And so it was really mostly just video games in general. Um, and what I've come to realize as a scholar was that games, going back to basically the beginning of video games, used fantasy as their kind of it's fantasy and sci-fi are the two big world building kind of
Mm.
genres that rely on world building as a tool to flesh out, huge fictional realms. These are the two places, of course, where games also um, kind of overlap and thrive very
Hmm.
well in rendering those, you know, immersive, thick description of like fantasy fictional universes in these virtual worlds. And
Hmm.
people caught on very quickly that those were good settings for even the earliest of games, which were of video games, which were, of course, non-visual. They were purely text-based on a computer screen.
Oh, I remember
Um,
those. I remember those games.
yeah, like early like MUDs, they're called MUDs, multi-user dungeons and things where you say, look to the east, and the computer tells, oh, to the east you see, the entrance to a dark forest. Oh, look
Yeah.
north, there's a
Is that the one?
waterfall.
Yeah. So the ones where you just have like the text, and sometimes there would be
Yes.
like little kind of images, very rudimentary, like images that make walking.
Yeah, I mean,
That,
early on, it didn't take long for this stuff to begin developing visual stuff as well.
mhm. So
Oh,
do we
excuse me.
have? Because I want to get into like the history of this, of where this all comes from. Is there a ground zero type? Is there a first game where this kind of Norse mythology, Viking age gets into? Have you found that? Is there like one game that's the first one where we see it?
Uh, yeah, I think based on what I've seen other people say and based on what I could find through like Googling and digital archives, the first video game with Viking related to it is a game from 1982 just called Viking.
Oh,
And
okay.
it's a very basic text-based resource management game for the Commodore 64. So it's one of these text-based non-visual games where it just is basically outputs of data on managing kind of a kingdom essentially. So it has more to do with, food and money and other resources and like getting hit with plagues and things like that. So um,
That's quite interesting that it's. I mean, I guess it's they're governed a little bit by what they can do, but that
yeah,
it's this management game versus like what you what most people find so synonymous with Vikings is this violence and the fighting, and that's what a lot of people are attracted to in the fun. Whereas this is quite, I
yeah,
don't want to say boring, but it's that kind of thing of, well, you just have to live the life of quote unquote Viking and manager stuff.
yeah. It's essentially, like I said, it's basically a survival game, which you see is also very popular with the broader image of Vikings. These people hardened by the cold north, blah 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 blah, all of this
Mm-hmm.
stuff. Survivalists, people who can survive also in
Mm-hmm.
battle, wounds that fell other people. Vikings kind of just, laugh it off and then kill 10 more people.
Yeah.
Uh, so it's there from the beginning, but yeah, no, it is funny that it's kind of this math survival text log game
Mm-hmm.
instead of some sort of text-based adventure game, but
Mm-hmm.
where you're a Viking. Um,
So that's the first, I guess, video game.
yes,
Where
this is the first Viking video game.
so then where do we see, or what do you think opens the door for that? And I know I kind of already know the answer because we spoke about it a little bit before, but where does this all come from? Because this obviously isn't the first time the Vikings have seen immense popularity. It's anybody who's listened to this podcast for any amount of time knows that it's something that popped up since probably since the end of the Viking Age. At some point throughout time, it's just a reoccurring theme that this popularity in this short kind of time period and very isolated to a small part of the world just seems to not go away. It comes up over and over again. But is there a
Yeah.
point where that then starts to feed into fantasy, then into video?
Yeah. Yes. So of course we already mentioned Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings films, um, and people know Tolkien for those films and for his or for the writing and for The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings and then the Silmarillion, and all these other books that they're publishing posthumously. Um, but most medievalists actually know Tolkien as a scholar,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a very prestigious linguist and philologist at the University of Oxford. Uh, and so he was essentially a master of uh, pretty much every dead Germanic language that we know of, and several other languages like Old Finnish and some old Celtic languages. Um, and these and the literatures in which that these languages were used for were his main source material for everything in the Middle Earth kind of legendarium. It's called all of his Middle Earth writings and imaginings and all the notes that he's left behind. All of this was taken from his interest in medieval languages and literature. Um, and so when you see things like one of the most famous examples is Rohan, the Rohirrim, these sort of horse lords on the plains. Uh, uh, they are very much based on the uh, uh, essentially, the Danish culture depicted in Beowulf, in the Old English epic Beowulf. And Tolkien is in his letters, he essentially admitted to rewriting the fate, like the kind of, classic Germanic fate of everybody basically just dies at the end. Everybody dies at the end. That's everyone's, that's your fate as a mortal. Um, but of course, in Beowulf, the kingdom falls apart.
Mm-hmm.
The shining, golden hall Heorot is destroyed, and then Beowulf's own people, the Yeats, are destroyed by the dragon, and then he's able to kill it at the very end as an old man with the help of his most loyal follower. But their last great king is destroyed, and it's sort of this portent of no more good times, if the events of Beowulf can be called good times. But uh, he essentially rewrote. with this term, what he called the eucatastrophe, or sort of the good catastrophe, the fate of the cultures depicted in Beowulf, especially the sort of uh, uh, the Danish culture of King Hrothgar, and he sort of rewrote them in this more heroic uh, light with a good ending,
Hmm.
as the Rohirrim of the Lord of the Rings. But and it's that's just, a very simple glossing over of the things, but every nook and cranny of this universe is full of references to medieval literature, and he was also, of course, an expert on uh, uh, Old Icelandic literature, and thus knew um, Old Norse sagas and Eddic poetry very, very well. One of the first things he read actually was probably a very cut down edition of Volsunga Saga when he was just a boy, and he became fascinated with this Dragon Slayer narrative. So from a very young age, he became obsessed with this stuff, and through the extreme global popularity of his books, even well before the movies, his books were being translated into many many languages and being spread all over the world, and essentially came to define fantasy as a genre. Basically, everybody who's ever come after Tolkien has either just stood on his shoulders or pretended to be doing their own thing, and then just ended up being, also on another on his toe. They go all the way, to the other end of fantasy and start writing, and they're still on his, his feet sticking out of the ground, basically. Or you get people like George R. R. Martin, who claimed to be writing, in response to Tolkien, and it's, well, that's still in connection to him. You're doing
Hmm.
what you're doing, in rebellion, but it's therefore he still has this hold over you. And people
So,
have done, really interesting things in the many years since he's originally published these works, but nobody really questions that he kind of made modern fantasy what it is.
I- was there not much fantasy before Tolkien, or did he just do it the best?
He was a huge nerd, and he did it really, really well, and he was a
Hmm.
fantastic writer. So that there was, he kind of did just do it the best, even if there's, people bring up problems with his writings from time to time, but nobody really questions the integrity of the works as a whole,
Hmm.
as literature, and their lasting impact. And there was fantasy before, like that's why I kind of tried to give myself the caveat by saying, he created modern fantasy, because
Yeah.
there was fantasy before him, of course, for many many centuries even. I mean, in medieval literature itself, these sagas are completely
Yeah,
weird
well,
and bizarre. They're
yeah, of
basically
course,
just
yeah.
fantasy, uh, to a certain, but even in the modern period before the 20th century, there was definitely fantasy, but it was mostly seen as, things for kids, like little boys and girls.
Hmm.
It wasn't taken seriously as a genre. It was basically just, pulp fiction before pulp fiction, really. Um,
So
so yeah,
when I think this probably comes true to Tolkien's work and even the work that they do with video games. At what point do things become, I guess, original when you're 'cause, with Tolkien? Obviously, he's taking so much from quote unquote original text, original sources. He's looking back at the Icelandic sources, or dead languages and all this stuff, and then kind of just rebranding it almost and putting it together into its own thing. So, at what point does that just become kind of like moving stuff around and putting it together versus like individuality? And I'm not like
sure.
knocking Tolkien's work, but I mean,
No,
and that kind of works through everything. Like same with like, I love Game of Thrones, but at the end of the day, like you can look at Game of Thrones and go, oh, that's medieval England. That's the North. The North is clearly like Yorkshire. Everyone sounds like they're from Yorkshire. Everyone's hardy like they're from Yorkshire. And it's kind
yeah,
of like you get the South. It's like the North-South divide that you have in England. It's like very much like So it's like
yeah,
reality, but you know, just dressed up different. And I've always wondered this of where when you're using original sources, that line kind of
yeah,
ends.
yeah. I mean, it's course, it's sort of an interesting loaded question in a way because it brings into focus ideas of like high and low culture,
Hmm.
original works and derivative works, and this kind of these sort of dualisms that we have and that we often use with sort of loaded intention, even when we don't want to, even when we love fantasy stuff like this.
Hmm.
But it very much is a temporal matter because medieval people had no such compunctions about just stealing left and right and borrowing and rewriting and editing and translating and doing all of this work. This was just the way things were done because you had what you had and there was, people
Hmm.
people made changes to material as they went, especially like anytime you translate something, you're drastically changing, the meaning, the tone, you have to completely change the register. Oh, there's not a word for this in the target language. Well, I have to just come up with something or use something adjacent, basically. And this is what leads to, essentially the formation of new genres
Hmm.
in the language that you're translating into. If something has never been translated into a new language before, that new language is about to get slammed with a bunch of weird conventions and words that they've never encountered before. This happened in Old Norse with the rise of translating courtly romances, these old French romances of King Arthur's court and knights and uh, kings and queens and things like this. These essentially fairy tales that we call them today. They suddenly got this new genre basically out of it, and then they started composing so-called indigenous romances or romances composed purely in Icelandic in Old Norse. Um, and they were, of course, very derivative in this sense, but they were also new because they were new stories of people who never existed or who weren't, they weren't Arthurian knights. They weren't named knights from French or Welsh tradition
Hmm.
or anything like that. Um, they were weird things. They were like, oh, weird things happen in France apparently, but weird things happen in Iceland too. So let me write, essentially a knight's tale about that, a romance. So yeah, medieval people had no compunctions about just stealing left and right. All of this stuff was anonymous. The only types of literature that weren't anonymous, in at least in Old Norse, were these these skaldic poems, these sort of poems that are attached to named poets, usually poets of earls and kings in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century. Um, in the continent, in the European continent, there's of course we have more names for these kinds of prose works, but there's plenty of even those names are more attributions than like signed authorships basically. So it's sort of a matter of not really caring that
Hmm.
if work is good, then it's good. If it's good fiction, it's good fiction.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I didn't mean it even
no, no,
in
no.
a negative
Just
way because I think that, you know, there's not an original thought left probably in the world. Somebody is
yeah,
whatever
I
you
I
think,
I
somebody has had it.
personally I personally free myself from the responsibility of original thoughts because I
Yeah.
don't I don't believe in them.
Somebody will have had it somewhere at some point.
Yeah.
So I think that no matter what, everything is in, I mean, and you would be completely naive to think that all your life experiences, you couldn't be a scholar, particularly not to his level, and then ignore all of that and not take inspiration from that. So
Yeah.
there is obviously a difference between inspiration and like copying, and he's clearly like changed things. And
Yeah.
so it wasn't
I
a
mean,
negative knock on that. I just
no, no.
wondered where that
Yeah.
kind of line was.
Just one last thing about Tolkien actually, because there's an interesting tidbit is that he actually created this whole universe that we know and love today. Not itself from scratch. He actually started with the languages first, because like I said, he was a linguist first and
Hmm.
foremost. Sorry.
Wow.
Um, so he actually started inventing these fake languages, these, what would become Elvish and Dwarvish, and things like this, the Black speech, um, first, and gave them full rigorous grammars and vocabulary and things like that. But then was like, well, these languages don't make sense, just by themselves. So he wrote an entire history to give the language context basically. So he created the world from the language first. Um,
Wow.
so it's a really
That's
it's kind of a you know the reverse of what most people
hmm
would approach world building. They would start with, oh, how does my universe, how does my cosmos form? Oh, there's like a prime deity who emerges from, the void, very
hmm
Genesis, comes from darkness, claps his hands and creates, the first spark, the first, creation
Yeah.
of light and heat and basically a big bang kind of thing. But he was like, no, he was just messing around with his languages that he loved to do. And then was like, well, I have to give these, who are the people that speak these languages? Oh, okay.
Wow.
So
That's
that's
fascinating.
pretty original. But
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
mm,
So, okay, so we have Tolkien. So how do we get from Tolkien and his love of language and clear love of Northern European
mhm.
history? How do we get from there to modern video games?
Yeah. So like I said, Tolkien was an expert of medieval Europe in general, but the languages and literature specifically of like northern medieval Europe and the Nordics. Um, and like I said, Tolkien's writing, which was heavily inspired and used this stuff very freely, then went on to become so popular that it essentially uh, set the conventions for the modern literary genre of fantasy. So everybody coming after him was writing this kind of stuff as well, and it's very popular. It remains popular up to the present day, and like I said, those films did a lot in also pushing that type of geek medieval fantasy very much into the mainstream. But even before that, you had people who were already geeky for medieval stuff, particularly medieval warfare. And these guys would get together and play types of tabletop games.
Hmm
Before D&D, you had, various types of tabletop medieval gaming called medieval miniature wargaming. And these looked kind of like these real-time strategy games that I mentioned, like Age of Empires, where you see, armies kind of crashing on the screen. Uh, but it was like Warhammer. It's like all these figurines and very detailed rules and numbers go into and dice rolls and things like that, statistics determine the outcome of these campaigns, basically. And in 1971, a familiar named guy, Gary Gygax, and owner of one such miniature shop, um, named Jeff Perrin, they released their own system called Chainmail, it's medieval miniature wargaming, which had a 14, I think 14-page supplement in the back called the Fantasy Supplement. And this was a additional rule set where if you wanted to play in a completely fictional fantasy, medieval fantasy universe with their their figurines and their rules, you could. And it basically explained, it added in features like hero classes and wizards and orcs and dwarves and hobbits and things like that. And so all of this also they were pulling from fantasy authors like Tolkien, especially. They basically made it so you could play this miniature war game in Middle Earth. But
hmm
they were also drawing on other fantasy people like Robert E. Howard, the guy who made Conan the Barbarian, and
Okay,
a
yeah.
few other people who were around and were popular in the latter 20th century. And it became really popular, so much so that they turned that into its own dedicated rule system, which they released Dungeons and Dragons in 1974. And then it was Gygax and another guy named Dave Arneson. Uh, and that basically combined in the same way it combined the fictional trappings of Tolkien's kind of fantasy with a few other people thrown in the mix, um, with the sort of technical elements, the rules and the use of dice to determine chance and the outcome of actions and events uh, in this very mathematical way. And it also reduced the scope from these big armies clashing down to the so-called party of adventurers,
Hmm.
essentially, which is essentially like a one-to-one copy of the Fellowship of the Ring, this small elite band trying to transport the ring uh, into Mordor to destroy it. So you reduce the scope from, two players with a bunch of, hundreds of units under their control to, each player controlling one or maybe two adventurers. And so it
Okay.
reduced the scope down to this sort of classic D&D formula that we have today, which of
Hmm.
course you can do all kinds of things outside the box, but that's sort of the classic, small party of adventurers, probably starts in a tavern, finds out
Yeah.
some big evil thing is happening and they got to go stop it, or they never make it out of the tavern. They play
Hmm.
there for 20 hours. Um, and then eventually, these begin to become computerized because these very technical rules, like statistics and things like that, and the use of dice to determine outcomes and random chance, these are very quantifiable things, and that makes them very good for computerization. So
Okay.
very quickly, you find the first computer games are using these types of games, are adapting these types of games where the computer handles all of the dice rolls, all the random chance, all the numbers, so you can get instant computation of these statistics and damage and health and the random chance and things like that.
Hmm. Wow. So, and then is it just a natural progression from there into video games with fantasy, and then obviously you start to feed in different mythologies?
Yeah, um, like I said, there was already a few games. Uh, like it becomes kind of a mix of everything happening all at once because technology, like the 20th century, and especially the second half of the 20th century into, up to the present is a day of is a period of ever increasing speed and technological development. So as this stuff starts to pick up, and it grows, computers originally were basically these huge, fridge-sized noisy things that only, the only people who could have them were basically military research facilities and civilian research facilities like MIT.
Yeah.
And these people began playing with them, sort of making fun, making games with these huge computers very early, apparently. Uh, but after that, you get, the arrival of the home computer and things like that. And so in a matter of a few decades, you get, the computer, you know, basically comes into existence and starts being used for games. D&D is created in the 70s. In the 80s, you get some of the first Viking video games. But even before that, you see, arcades and things like that becoming popular.
Hmm.
And you get, yeah, very, very quickly, you get some medieval types of games. You get this text-based game that I mentioned. But then just 2 years later, in 1984, you get another game called Viking Raiders, which was this sort of turn-based, I think, multiplayer kind of strategy battle game with a Viking theme
Hmm.
for multiple players to play, like, in person.
So it feels as though the early ones were based around like like I guess a factual Viking, actual Viking raiders, or people who went to Viking, like that kind of like real historical events, if that makes sense. You know, the battles that happened, the raiding of, you know, the British Isles or wherever they went, right, versus this kind of fantastical, um the deities and the
Yeah, the
mythology.
myth. Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems like it was very much based on the actual like Viking conquests.
Yeah.
At what point do we see like Thor being added in, or Odin, and this kind of mythology, or is can we even pinpoint that?
Yeah. I'm pretty sure the first I'm trying to think. if one of these earlier ones, I'm looking at my big list right now. Because yeah, like you do hit the hammer on the head. These early 80s ones are mostly like Vikings as Vikings, not all of their
Hmm.
gods and the idea of like Thor coming in
Yeah,
and things like that.
but
They're
that's it.
mostly
Sorry, no, sorry to
no,
jump
go
in, but
go ahead, go ahead.
it feels like now you can't have a Viking game or a Viking TV show without everybody wanting to know where's
Hmm.
Thor, when's Thor going to turn up, when's Odin going to
Right.
turn up, when are the
Yeah,
gods
yeah.
going to happen, when are these deities going to appear. If you just had a even watching the Vikings TV show, which is very much a historical base, whether it might not be historically accurate, but it's that kind of just everyday normal life. It's not very fantastical, but you're still in the back. You still get these figures that appear. You're like, ooh, that could be Odin, or there's like
Right.
the 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 big waterfall in Iceland that's like very portrayal of like Valhalla. It still is in there, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much uh packaged now. You can't
Mm,
have the Viking warriors without the Viking gods anymore.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Do
and there
we
were,
do we see that? Oh, sorry, I was gonna say, do we see where that kind of happens?
yeah, I again, I've written very limited descriptions for myself of these games, but I think some of these begin to mention, and I'm probably again missing because there's no
Mm,
reason that maybe, the intro to something like, the Viking game that I mentioned, the 1982, the first one, the like survival game. Maybe there's a mention of Odin in the
oh yeah, okay.
beginning kind of flavor text where it says, "Oh, you are a Viking warlord. You must manage your, granaries and your peasants, and stave off cold and disease. May Odin save you." So it could
Yeah,
fully
okay.
already be there from the beginning,
Mm,
but they begin to become more in the limelight, like they take more center stage or more active roles kind of in the 90s.
mm,
There's a game called Dusk of the Gods, which is obviously an allusion to Ragnarok, where your goal is, and it's kind of like this isometric 3D adventure game. So it's an actual video game in the sense of like a visually uh, uh, moving game where you have a direct feedback loop of you controlling something that moves around the screen. Um, and that is about, trying to help the gods avert the catastrophe of Ragnarok. You have to like find the head of Thor's hammer. You have to find I think you have to find a belt for Heimdall, or a cuirass for Heimdall for some reason.
mm,
You have to get Odin's spear, I think. And if you don't complete them by a certain point, then the game tells you, you basically failed to help the gods and everyone dies.
mm,
Uh, but then, and you get other games like Heimdall, which is a very strange game that I found while I was doing research to actually teach a class on this subject, which was a lot of fun. And I found that it has a lot of uh, direct visual references to the 1956 Vikings movie,
okay.
which was a huge Hollywood blockbuster thing. And there's direct visual references between this game from 1991 and this film. And it's also about, adventuring as immortal, but trying to help the gods, basically.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, I just pulled up because I was interested when the first appearance of Thor into Marvel
yeah.
comic books was, and its journey into mystery 83 in 1982. So you would imagine, there's no,
Is that right?
yeah. So it's not a hidden.
Hmm.
Yeah, it says 1982 was the first appearance of Thor in a comic, or in the Marvel comics, and it's no, it's no secret that gamers and comic book enthusiasts are probably quite similar. So I assume it would make sense if you're getting a rise of a character in the comic sphere, you would get that want to see that similar sort of character come over into games as well.
Yeah, maybe. I'm just, I'm actually kind of astounded that it's at 1982
Let
is
me
the
double
first,
let me double
because
check.
one of a professor here actually at the University of Iceland wrote a really good book called Echoes of Valhalla.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one of the main chapters is all about the comic, the comic reception of Norse mythology, mainly through Thor. And there's a lot of stuff with, Jack Kirby and stuff. So this suggests that it's back during the, you know, 40s and 50s when Thor shows up, because at a time they understood that the Nazis were using this stuff at the same
Mm-hmm.
time that they were trying to use it. So sometimes Thor is the leader of the Nazis, and sometimes Thor shows up and says, you're not my true followers, and then destroys all the Nazis. So like there's competing and this isn't necessarily Marvel, but there's competing portrayals of him uh, kind
Yeah.
of kind of grappling on the comic book page with our understanding of Thor in the modern period. Oh, is he the leader of the Aryans? Is he their god like they say he is? Or
Mm-hmm.
uh is he, actually like a lost pagan deity who has no relation to, the modern horrors of modern war and the Holocaust, and the Nazis are all just crazy kooks. So sort of in this very fascinating sort of comic book history chapter, this professor here, Jon Carl Helgeson, sort of shows this progression of character up to the modern kind of
Mm-hmm.
Marvel iteration.
Okay, so this is what you just explaining. I just did a little more
Hmm.
reading. So Thor appeared in the Marvel comics in 1962 in the Journey to Mystery 83. Uh, but this was prior to that. Jack Kirby obviously worked for DC, and Thor appeared in Tales of the Unexpected 16 in 1957.
Right.
So he obviously appeared in DC Comics prior
Okay.
to Marvel, but it seems as though the first
Okay.
appearance is about
You
1957, it seems.
you said 62 for Marvel though?
62 for Marvel.
Okay, because you said 82 the previous time, and I
Oh,
was like,
did I?
and
Oh,
I was
sorry.
like, whoa, okay, that's crazy.
Oh,
That's way
sorry.
way later than I thought it was, but
Oh, okay, okay. Maybe, yeah, I misspoke. No,
okay.
62.
You had me
Yes.
questioning everything I
Uh,
knew.
oh, I do apologize. No, 62 for Marvel, 57 for DC. But yeah, so what I was doing, kind of looking for that was this idea
Yeah.
that that popularity and that character growing in popularity in comics, people are going to want to see that in games.
Yeah. Yeah. That can certainly account for it. Um, and that's, you know, part of my kind of passive argument in my research is that, you can count these games before the 2010s, like very on a fairly short list. Like right here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 games. There's
Mm-hmm.
probably some I'm missing, but let's be generous and say like 25 games before 2010 that have to do with Vikings and or Norse mythology. And
Mm-hmm.
then afterwards, I've been compiling this list more, but it's like quadruple that already
Mm-hmm.
since 2010. Um, and
And
there's
do you think that is down to that time period of when
yeah, I mean
of
that's this current popular
Mhm.
surge of Viking and Norse mythology stuff since like 2010. It's
Perfect?
just like there's tons of B and C movies being made about Viking.
Mm-hmm.
I had a pretty comical list for my class when I taught it, because I was mostly focusing on game stuff, but I was like, there's also like it's all over popular culture, and there's like the Viking blood of the Vikings, the Viking women Vikings, sword
Mm-hmm.
Vikings, king Vikings, axe Vikings,
So you
Viking
just got to throw the
explosion.
Viking word in there somewhere.
Yeah, and so it's just all of these you know terrible like B movies just being churned out to try to make a dollar off of
Mm-hmm.
the fact that Vikings are so in right now.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that in video games in sure, you see lots of like cash grab kind of small companies probably just churning these things out, but there's lots of indie titles, which is what Valheim essentially turned out to be. That was made by a five-person team and released in 2021, and it was a huge success because everyone was stuck inside uh, during COVID, but it was also a really well-made game, fun time-consuming game, just spend a lot of time playing with your friends,
Yeah.
and because it was about Viking stuff and it did a good job at that, so
Hmm.
it capitalized on that popularity as well.
Hmm. I guess so. We're kind of up to date now with the history of it in games. And one thing that I always wonder is the responsibility, I guess, to portray things not necessarily historically accurate, but when you're taking characters like Thor and Odin and the deities. Now, it's always referred to as mythology, but it is a religion, and I guess it is a religion. Certainly, at the moment, seems to be growing in popularity. There is this resurgence in paganism and
Yeah.
people who would class this as their religion. So, 'cause you wouldn't like take Jesus really and put him in a video game and have him, or not very often anyway, and like battling through these different things. So, what do you think makes it so acceptable to kind of do it with the Nordic kind of religion?
Right.
Does that make sense? That kind of like boundary of like
Yeah.
what makes it okay and okay not to, and do you think that could change as maybe more people become? And also, I guess to like Scandinavians, it's like part of their history, and
Hmm.
depending on how it's portrayed, maybe in the latest Thor movie, the Love and Thunder one.
Yeah.
It was a little bit silly. It was a little bit jokey, and I guess that could be maybe deemed offensive to some Scandinavians if it's like, well, that's kind of like our culture. You wouldn't do that about you know the Prophet Muhammad. I know it's maybe like different, but it would certainly be deemed completely kind of off.
Yeah, they wouldn't be laughing.
Yeah, it
Uh,
wouldn't be. Yeah, it wouldn't be something that you would even consider. So it's like I've always wondered where that kind of boundary is and what makes it okay. And I don't suppose you will have a solid answer, but I wondered what your thoughts were.
no, but it's an interesting question. It's something I grapple with a lot because even though I come from a background in like just medieval history essentially, but I've always focused on literature. Um, when I came here to do the master's program and really focused in on Old Norse culture, I also learned a lot. I studied a lot about myth and religion and things like that. So I am pretty up to date on the mythology and the aspects of pre-Christian Nordic religion. Um, or what has been argued at least, because obviously you can't reconstruct something for which there's literally no records
Mm-hmm.
of its practice, and there's the archaeological evidence is like Terry Gunnell always liked to joke about. He would say, it's like showing up to a party the day after and trying to piece together what's happened from, all you have is the Christmas tree like rolling down the hill and popped balloons and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really, that difficult plus 1,000 years of dirt and things, piled up around
Yeah.
for these poor archaeologists. But I get what you're saying as well about, the portrayal of figures in media. Um, things like games and films are like incredibly powerful uh, uh, types of storytelling. And that's why, like I said, at the very beginning, people get really up in arms about their cultural media of choice. They have fights and things like that about casting
Mm-hmm.
these days. It's a huge thing because everyone's kind of secretly a racist, apparently. So if you cast, a beloved character with an actor
Mm-hmm.
of a different skin color, then suddenly you're, burning the Bible. You're destroying their version of the Bible. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and perhaps, the reason it's more acceptable to find, uh, yeah, yeah, like you're saying, Jennifer, the ICEA themselves are irreverent, but it's also like people have made the argument, scholars have made the argument that the Prose Edda in particular, like the kind of vaunted source for Norse mythology, um, which itself has a lot of issues with, the idea of portraying a coherent mythology rather than just a bunch of kind of gods. And people argue that Snorri sort of cobbled them together into something resembling the Greco-Roman sort of coherent pantheon or like a family of gods. But scholars have argued that like the Prose Edda or Snorri's Edda is itself extremely sarcastic And it's easy to get that sense also from the poems, the Poetic Edda, which have a lot of irreverence and sarcasm and misdirection, and they contradict themselves all the time. And people have wondered for a long time whether these authors and scribes who were putting down this material, which they themselves valued very highly, this was their culture and the culture of their very respected, if pagan, ancestors, about whom they, of course, wrote this whole corpus of the sagas of Icelanders. This is mostly about, pre-Christian and then Christianizing settlers in the ninth to 10th centuries. Um, so these are their, direct ancestors. Um, so they still respected this material, but they also, yeah, poked fun at it all the time,
Hmm.
relentlessly. And some of that has certainly been channeled into the way that I think modern Scandinavians view this culture. So now that it's being sort of uh, uh, turned kind of into a reconstructed religion,
Hmm.
this will obviously like influence some things to come. Um, but it's the fact that we're not all Norse pagans makes it easier to, of course, portray them on the screen with nobody getting upset. Um, people people do put, Jesus Christ on screen all the time.
But yeah, Jesus is one that probably is a bit different because he does get quite openly
Yeah, yeah. It's
mocked.
it's yeah,
But you
but
don't get many like games bit. But then again, I don't know what games you can make about like Christianity in that sense. How
they
far?
don't no like so far there isn't a game. I'm sure there's lots of
Yeah,
game, but there isn't like a huge AAA like blockbuster equivalent kind of like essentially like true when I say AAA, they're essentially the equivalent of like a Hollywood film, like a
yeah.
huge budget, huge cast, blah 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 blah. Everyone waits and goes to see it. And
Hmm.
there hasn't, I don't think there's been like Jesus Christ,
No,
wielding a huge sword, wielding the cross as a gun or something like that.
yeah, yeah.
In
It's
indie games, I guarantee that hundreds of those have been made by just
for sure.
goofy people on the internet. Um, but a lot of this has to do with, yeah, the image, I think, of Vikings that's been built up over now centuries, like you said, even probably since the end of the Viking Age,
Hmm.
people have been writing things about these people, some good, some bad, some comedic, and some, sarcastic and things like that. Some fearful, early medieval English accounts of the Viking raids, paint them as, enemies of God, as uh, uh, or as the punishment of God, essentially for not being devout enough and things like that. Um, so the image of the Viking, though, over time has been built up to be one of like violence, uh, but also of this sort of like, a foolhardy adventurer who can sort of just go with fully courageously into the unknown.
Hmm.
And that inspires a lot of different things, like the use of Viking imagery in space voyages, like the Viking Voyager, naming moons and satellites and things after gods and goddesses and heroes like Sigurður and things like that, um, because of the correspondence between outer space and the ocean and things like that. It's like the final frontier. Who better to go explore it than the Vikings, the most famous and fearsome of our historical adventurers?
Hmm.
And so a lot of this is built into their narrative. Um, uh, and a lot of it is also, like I said, it's also caricature. You get just as you get the image of the fearsome, berserker or the shield maiden as like extremely fearsome opponents that no one wants to face on a field. You also have the sort of comedic caricature of the drunken, Viking Scandinavian type who just, is sitting around feasting and cheering, and
Yeah.
it's a weird system. I always forget the name of this comedian who did a bit about rape and pillage. He's like, raping and pillaging are terrible, but when you put them together, apparently it's all good fun. We'll just
Mhm.
go do some rape and pillage, and he really hit the narrow. Yeah, yeah, it's Minsk. Yeah, uh, really
I
great,
always,
great bit.
yeah, I always think it's quite funny how that side of in especially certainly in today's modern sort of culture of how things have been in the last about 10 years, how the Vikings just skirt by that. They keep all the cool side of it, but yet that kind of rape and pillage and the not very nice things that they did just seems to be ignored. You can have very kind of you know left leaning people who just still love the Viking Age and kind of just ignore this whole part of what they did. And I find it quite fascinating that they just kind of get a pass. It's like just
Yeah.
let's just it was different then. Let's just ignore that bit.
Yeah, they don't get a pass inside the field of
Okay.
study at least. We're
Okay.
very critical about it, and we're also very skeptical of each other because there's historically been problems with people who try to come into this field to take, this, with quote unquote good intentions, but they end up being people who essentially want to, recreate or well, I'm not gonna uh postulate about what their like actual machinations are, but they're people who romanticize the Vikings and everything that they represent in terms of their hyper violence, hyper masculinity,
Okay. Yeah.
ultra individualism. This sort of like, oh, like a real Viking, is just a man and he just beats up and kills and rapes whoever he wants to and just drinks and has no
Hmm.
compunctions. And when he dies a glorious hero's death and goes to Valhalla to keep doing more of the same until the end of the world.
Yeah.
Um, and that stuff is, as fictional as it is problematic because again we can't recreate the mindset of actual Vikings in the same way that we can't recreate their practices of a pre-Christian belief system. So a lot of this stuff has been invented in the past, like it's in the literature. Some of these things are there. The seeds for all of this stuff is in the medieval literature, but a lot of it has been piled on top of by
Hmm.
centuries of reception and popularization. And what you said about, the leftist kind of a leftist can like Vikings right now without any compunctions. It's because that image does go through phases where scholars stress at times the violence and the slavery and the rape and the forced, colonization essentially. Um, and other times they scale it back because the image that they're selling becomes too one-sided and people begin saying, yeah, they're just, a bunch of rapists and slavers and things. So, well, no, they also, made peaceful settlements at places. They traded, they, you know, made connections and translated literature. They were great poets. So
Hmm.
they are just people like anyone else. They happen to have
Yeah.
a period of extremely advanced maritime warfare that made them famous and feared for all time, apparently. And they did lots of, questionable things, just like everybody else. And they're very complex characters, but complex characters aren't the best suited to popular manifestations at all times, which is why I've really enjoyed works that do have very deep characterization and complex storytelling, like God of War. I wrote an article on God of War just because I was so fascinated by how nuanced it was
Hmm.
with its retelling of, uh, particularly like Snorri's version of Norse mythology. Pardon me. Because it really turns it on its head, the idea of like a pantheon, and um, questioned a lot of these sort of masculine and violent essentialisms that we have about the Vikings and their gods.
Hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, let's wrap up the main show and then we'll do a little
Okay.
Q&A and let people ask some questions, or we'll just chat more about
Yeah.
these games and get your opinion on maybe some of the more modern popular ones and what you think they did right and what you
Yeah.
think maybe they did wrong, which could be fun. So Luca, do you have anywhere where people can follow you? I don't know if you have like a public profile or where people can read any of your articles.
Yeah. I mean, uh, I guess if you search my name on Google Scholar, you can find some of my work.
Hmm.
Um, I need to be better. I have a Twitter. I have an academic Twitter, uh, which I think is at Luca A Panaro, all
Hmm.
one word.
Yeah.
But I haven't posted anything there. I need to be better about, putting myself out there. But I just have the one article right now, so uh,
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, for anybody listening, like I say, if you can go and check out our Patreon, that is the best way to support the show. If you do like what we do and you get that bonus episode every week, and there are always a lot of fun questions in there. It's a little bit more lighthearted, a lot of jokes, and we kind of expand on what we've already touched on. And like I say, 5-star rating, positive review wherever you get your podcast. If you want to watch the shows, it's over on YouTube. Every show just goes up on there, and you can just pop it on. You can watch as we talk. A lot of the times, guests will bring in and have things that they hold up and show us, whether it's tends to always be like swords and
mm,
like little artifacts and things. So there's that visual aspect to it. And I
yeah.
think that's it. If you want to follow me, it's Daniel_Farron1 at Horns of Odin for the business, and then Nordic Mythology podcast across the board on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And that's it. Let's wrap this up.